everyone. So in this video, we are going to go over the PowerPoint on citations. Hopefully you have already gone through the previous lessons in this week's module, because this one I'm probably going to go through a little quicker. You'll see that there is a fairly easy pattern that emerges when we start looking at how to create proper citations for our sources. However, that pattern isn't going to be as apparent to you or as easy to, latch onto if you haven't gone through the previous lessons this week. And especially the lesson right before this one on reference entries. I'm going to be using a lot of the same examples that I used in that PowerPoint, so that we have some familiar examples to use in this PowerPoint. So again, if you haven't gone through the previous lessons this week, you probably should. At the very least, open up the links to the PowerPoints under the videos, and if those aren't really helping, then definitely watch the video where I go through the PowerPoint. But for this lesson, again, we're working on citations. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen and we'll get started. All right, and again, I'm not gonna put it in presentation mode because when we get to the end, I'm actually gonna be showing you how to create citations for a few example sources. All right, so again, we're working with citations. So this is our guide for how to create proper citations in APA format. So again, what are citations? I covered this in the lesson on the APA format basics, but we're going to talk a little bit more about it now. So citations are used in the body of your paper, like in your paragraphs, and it shows your reader when and where you have incorporated source material. Citations allow you to give credit to the original author or authors right then and there. As soon as that information is incorporated into your paragraph, you provide the citation to give credit to that author. It also provides the reader with the information they need to find that particular source on your references page, because the source entry on the reference page then allows the reader to find that whole source for themselves. So the citation in your paragraph lets them know where to find that source on your reference page, and then the full entry on the reference page allows them to go find that source for themselves. The citations appear in parentheses, right, immediately after the information from that source. So whether you have used a summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quote, it doesn't matter how the source material has been incorporated. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that as soon as it has been incorporated into your paragraph, you provide that citation immediately. And the citation is that set of parentheses that you see when you're reading an article. The information in the parentheses will include the beginning of that source's reference entry. That's how it matches up. So however that source begins on the reference list, that is the first thing you put in the parentheses for the citation, and then a comma, and then the date of publication. There's not a lot of information that goes inside the parentheses. It is typically an author's last name, a comma, and a year. That is the majority of citations. There are times, though, when the author is not a person, but an organization. And so instead of a last name being in the parentheses, it might be the name of an organization, and then a comma, and then the year. Sometimes we do have sources, though, where there's not an organization responsible for it. There's not an individual person responsible for it. And so there's no name of anything or any person or group to put inside the parentheses. In that case, how does the reference entry begin? Well, we learned in the previous lesson that more than likely the reference entry is going to begin with the title of that source. So that's what goes in the parentheses. So it's very important to understand the relationship between the citation and that source's entry on your reference page. And even though as you're reading a paper, you see the citations first in the paragraphs, and the reference list doesn't come until the very end, when you're actually writing a research paper, it is a very good practice to get into to create the reference list first, because it's that reference entry that helps you determine what to put inside the parentheses for your citations. So I really cannot stress that enough. Do the reference entries first. Even if they're not ordered, even if it's on a totally separate document, right? Like you're not even sure yet which sources you're going to use. You're not ready to actually do the true reference page yet. Have another document somewhere that has all the reference entries for your sources. So at least you can look there to see, here's the reference entry for this source. So here's what I need to put inside my parentheses for the citation for that source. And then when you finish with writing the essay and it's time to actually do the reference page, then you can start copying and pasting your reference entries in the correct order, right? You can do that. But one way or another, it is going to save you so much time and prevent you from possibly doing the citations incorrectly if you have the reference entries done first. And that is why that lesson came before this one. All right. So let's keep going here. We're going to look at citations for some commonly used sources, just like we looked at reference entries for commonly used sources. We're going to get through this a bit quicker, though, because you're going to see once you have the reference entry, creating the citation is really easy. So we have here a book with one author. Here is our example reference entry, right? This right here, right? Is it going to let me highlight? There we go, it did. All right, so here's our example reference entry. So how do we create the citation for that entry? Well, how does the entry begin? It begins with an author's last name. And we only have one author, so that's all we have to worry about. So that goes first in the parentheses for our citation, Sapolsky. Then we have our comma, right? And then the year. We see the year here in the reference entry, so we just put the year here in the citation. That's it. So let's look at a book with multiple authors. So here we have Svensson and Lober. I'm probably not pronouncing that second one right, but Svensson and Lober. So we have two authors now. If it's two authors, then we use both of their names in the citation. Svensson, ampersand, Lober, comma, year of publication right here, year of publication right here. That's it. Now we have a source with many authors. 3 or more, I believe, is when you'll use this format. So we have this whole list of authors right here. That's crazy. Obviously, we're not going to put all of that in the parentheses for our citation. That's too confusing and not reader-friendly at all. So in this case, when there's 3 or more authors, you're going to take the first author that's listed in the reference entry, because again, we go with how the entry begins, and it begins with this particular author's last name. So we put that particular author's last name in the citation. And then to indicate that there are multiple authors, more than just two, we use the abbreviation et al. That means and others, basically. So et al period, and then the comma, and then where's our year? Here's our year in the entry. So here's our year in the citation. So it's fairly simple when you're dealing with one author, right? How does the entry begin? With that author's last name. So what do we put in the citation? That author's last name. Then our comma, then the year. When it's two authors, still not terribly difficult. Just the first author's last name, then the ampersand, then the second author's last name, then our comma, and then our year. When we have three or more authors, we use just the first author's last name, the one that begins the entry, and then the abbreviation et al, period, then our comma, and then our year. Right? Okay. If we have a chapter in an edited book, when it comes to the citation, you do not need to worry about the fact that it's an edited book. It's going to look just like the citation for a normal book, right? So in this particular example, again, we have multiple authors. We have three, right? We have this author, Aaron, this author, Botella, and this author, Lubar. So again, since we have more than two, we're going to use the one that's listed first, how the entry begins, right? Aaron, Aaron. And then our abbreviation et al, period, then our comma, and then our date of publication, right? Here, here. So in the citation, it doesn't need to be mentioned that it's a chapter from an edited book. The reader will figure that out when they come to your reference page and see this entry. Then they'll know, okay, here are my authors, here's the title of what they wrote. Oh, and then I see this right here. These are the editors. So now I realize when I read the entry that this is from a bigger work. It's just a portion of a bigger edited work. Okay, but I don't need to know that when I read your citation. The only thing the citation is there for is to direct me to the correct place on your reference list. All right, our next example, a journal article, okay? So this particular example has multiple authors, more than two. So we know we're going to use the first author that's listed, how the entry begins, their last name, right? We're going to use our abbreviation to show that there's more than two authors, then our comma, and then our date of publication. Again, I don't need to know right away that that source information came from a journal article. Once I see your citation and then I come to your reference list and find that source, when I get to this psychology of popular media culture, then I'll realize it was an article from a journal. I don't need to know that in the citation though. You just give me the information I need to find that source on your list. That's why all of these are so similar. Newspaper article, exact same, right? Here's how the entry begins. We only have one author this time, so we don't need to worry about anything else. We put their last name there in the parentheses, then our comma, then our date of publication. And again, this is just a citation, so we don't need necessarily the date. We just need the year, and that's fine. Carrie, comma, 2019. A blog post. How does the entry begin? With the author's last name. So what goes in our citation? The author's last name. Then our comma, and then our year of publication, 2019. Or posting, year of posting, right? 2019. A YouTube video, right? So here's how our reference entry began, with the channel name that posted the video. So how does our citation begin? With that same name, because that's how the entry began. So Asian Boss, comma, 2020, the year that it was posted. A page on a news website. Remember, this isn't the same as a newspaper, online or print. A news site is one that is just all about the articles and the different pages of the website. It's not about a newspaper. But still, it's the same format for your reference or for your citation. How does your reference entry begin? With the author's last name. So that's what we start our citation with. Then our comma, and then our year of publication. You can see these, it's the same, almost the same pattern every time, because the reference entries will always begin with the author's last name if there is an author given. So if the entries, no matter what type of source, if the entries all begin with the author's last name, that's how all the citations are going to be created as well. It's really easy once you understand the relationship between the citation and the reference entry, and even easier once you know what the reference entry is. You see how easy this is for me? Because I already have this source, I have the reference entry already figured out. I don't have to think much about what the citation is going to be at all. I know. I come to the beginning of the entry. That's what I use in my citation, right? Next example is for a government agency or group author. So we've used this source in our paper. This is the reference entry for it. How do we cite it? Well, how does the reference entry begin? It begins with that government agency's name, National Institute of Mental Health. So that's what I put in my citation, National Institute of Mental Health, then my comma, and then my year. Here's another one with an organizational group. I've used information from this source. How does this source entry begin? It begins with World Health Organization. So that's what I put in my citation. Then my comma, then my year. This type of source is when you have just a regular web page or a section of a website. It's a credible website, but there's no author or group or organization that's being credited for what's written. Well, I'm sorry, there is an author. So how does the entry begin? With the author's last name. So it doesn't matter that it's just a regular website. We still start our citation with that author's last name, because that's how the reference entry starts. Then our comma, then our year. So this is when we have no author provided. So we know, based on the previous lesson on reference entries, that when you have a source, especially a page on a website or a section of a website that does not have an author provided or an organizational author, then we begin the entry with the title of that page or section. So since this is how the reference entry begins, that's what's going to go in my citation. I can shorten it a little bit since this is a fairly lengthy title, all 33 Chile miners freed in flawless rescue. For my citation, I can cut that down a little bit to just all 33 Chile miners, because again, all this is doing is letting my reader know where to find it on the reference page. So if they see this in my paragraph where I've cited the source, all 33 Chile miners, they can still come to my reference page and find this source really easily, even though I didn't put the full title in the citation. I put enough so that they would be able to figure out which source corresponds to that citation. So no author. So we still use the beginning of the entry. The beginning of the entry is the title. So the title is what we put in the citation, most of it. And then a comma, and then our year. So what happens if we have an author but no date? Especially when you're dealing with websites. There's often not a date of publication given. Well, how does the entry begin? With the author's last name. So what goes in our citation to start with? The author's last name. Then our comma. But now, instead of a year where the date should be, we don't have a date of publication. So we learned in the previous lesson that when that happens, we use the letters N period, D period to indicate that there was no date given. So that's what we put here in the citation, right? We don't leave it blank just because there's no date. We still match it up to whatever was put in the reference entry. All right. So now we have a page on a website with no author and no date. Well, we've already learned that when we don't have an author of any kind, we start the entry with the title of that web page or the section of the website we're on. In this case, we were in the section on neurology. That's how we started the entry. That's what will go in the citation. There was no date of publication indicated for that section of the source. So we used ND in our reference entry. We're going to use ND in our citation. So let's practice. Okay. So here we have a reference entry, and when we look through it, we know that it was a YouTube video. So how do we create the citation for this source? Well, we're going to start our parenthesis first of all, right? And we know that the first piece of information in our citation should match up with how the entry begins on the reference list. How does this one begin? It begins with the name of the channel that posted the video, which was Ask ASC. So that's what we're going to put, Ask ASC. Then our comma, and then what year was this video posted? 2020. Close out your parenthesis. There's our citation for this source. Next one. Here we have an article from WebMD that has an author, but no date of publication. So how do we create this citation? Start our parenthesis. How does the entry begin? It begins with this author's last name. So that's what we're going to put in our citation. Doheny, comma. What's our year of publication? Oh, we don't have one. So N, comma, D, or period, N period, D period, close out our parentheses. That's our citation. Next one. Here we have, let's see, publications of modern, this is a journal article with multiple authors, right? L. Eddy, K. English, B. Schaum, and S. Andrew Vaughn. So how are we going to create our citation for this source? Start our parenthesis. All right, how does this entry begin? It begins with this author's last name, right? So EDDY, and it's more than two authors. So I know I have to do our abbreviation, ETAL, period. Then my comma, and then what's my year of publication? 2018. Close out my parentheses. That's the citation for this source. Next, we have an entry on Wikipedia. It looks like it's about the poem Footprints. So there's no author and there's no date. So how do I create my citation? Well, what does the entry begin with? It begins with the word footprints. So that's what I'm going to put. Footprints, comma, what's our year of publication? We don't have one. So N period, D period, close out my parentheses. That is our citation for this source. All right, here we have a book, right? So it looks like Only one author. This should be really easy. So what do I put in my citation? What does the entry begin with? It begins with this person's last name. So that's what's going to go in my citation. R-A-T-H-U-S, comma, what's our year of publication? 2015. Close out my citation. That's it. Next one, we have, it looks like, a book with two authors. So how does my entry begin? It begins with this author's last name. So that's what I'm going to put in the citation, Summers. Okay, but we have two authors. So now I have to go ahead and use my ampersand, right? And then the second author's name. Then my comma. What's the year of publication? 2016. Okay, there you go. And our last one here, we have, it looks like an article from a website, Life Science. Looks like we have an author and we have a year, so this should be pretty easy. What does the entry begin with? The author's last name, Wanjek. Then our comma, what's our year of publication? 2012. There you go. Once you have the reference entry correct, figuring out what goes in the parentheses for your citation is really quite easy. But you have to make sure that the reference entry is correct first. And you have to just remember the relationship, the connection between the citation and the reference entry for that source. If you don't have the reference entry created yet, then yeah, trying to figure out what your citation is each time is going to be a little time consuming and possibly confusing. So creating the reference entries first is just smart work. I always say work smarter, not harder. So do yourself a big favor and see how much it helps you in figuring out what to put in those parentheses. If you have it already finished, the reference entries, figured out, even if it's on a separate document, if you already have those figured out, you're going to save yourself so much time as you're writing the essay. Every time you use information from one of your sources, you're automatically going to be able to look at that list and know what to put in the parentheses. Even, you don't have to go back and try to figure it out or try to fix it. You can do it right then and there. It saves you so much time and so much frustration. If you understand the relationship between citations and reference entries, and you do the reference entries first, it's going to be a game changer. All right, so in review, remember citations are used to show the reader exactly where you've used information from one of your sources. The citation, the parentheses, they are placed immediately after the source information. We looked at this in the first lesson this week on APA format basics. In that video, I pulled up a sample APA essay, and we looked at where we saw a citation, where we saw parentheses, and talked about how that information right then and there is what came from that source. Not information that came somewhere earlier in the paragraph or somewhere later in the paragraph, but right then and there, that's where the information from that source is located. Citations are required no matter how you've incorporated source information. Citations are required no matter what type of format you're using to write a paper. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's APA, MLA, Chicago. It doesn't matter if you haven't even been required to write in any format whatsoever. You're just told, write a paper and use some sources, and you have free reign on everything else about the paper. You still have to somehow indicate where you've used source information, right? It doesn't matter ever what format you're using, or if you're even using a format at all. Citations of some sort are required all the time, no matter what, if you have used information from another source. Anything at all in your essay that are not your original ideas or your original words, you have to give credit to whoever's ideas or words those are. In APA format, we have a particular way of doing that. We call them citations, and we've just learned what goes in those parentheses, right? Doesn't matter if it's a summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quote. Yes, even if you have something in quotation marks that clearly tells the reader that these words came from one of my sources, you still have to give the citation every time. Any source that is cited in the paper has to appear on your reference list. It has to. Any source that's listed on your reference list must be cited. There must be at least one citation somewhere in the paper of that source. The information that goes in the parentheses, the information that's included in the citation, should include the beginning of that source's reference entry, a comma, and either the year of publication or the abbreviation in period D period, if there is no date of publication. And once again, creating the proper reference entry for your sources first will help you figure out what should go in the parentheses for your citations every time. All right, so that's about all I have for this one. I hope that having gone through the lessons in the order that I put them in this week helped you get to this one, and it make a lot more sense than what it perhaps has in the past for you, and that you can kind of see how everything kind of works together, and how, if you know how they're supposed to work together, then it's not quite so intimidating to use APA format. You know, there are plenty of places you can go on the internet for to answer questions that you have, or if you've forgotten one particular thing, or there's YouTube videos. Go to apa.org and go to their APA style section. But I'm always here as well, and you can always come back to these lessons and review the information. So I hope that it has helped. But please don't be super intimidated by it. It's really not as intricate as it probably seems at first. Just remember, hey, if I create the reference entry first, it'll be pretty easy to figure out what my citation is. So let's work on the reference entry. How do I do the reference entry? Well, I can either go back to the PowerPoint, I can go to apa.org and see the formula, and then plug in my information to create that entry. Once you do that, it really all works together pretty well. All right. If you have any questions or run into any problems, especially this week while you're working on the paper, let me know. Otherwise, you're free to move on.